The next topic that I'm going to talk about is the 2D to 3D transformation. This 2D to 3D transformation is basically related to the enhancing the grasping accuracy of the robot. As I previously mentioned, that the robot take the 2D take the picture of the object, and then if we have the complete information of that image, then the robot can open its arm and accurately grasp that object. So how can we increase this grasping accuracy of the robot? So if we have full information of the object, we can use the robot to grasp it accurately, and that's how we use the 2D to 3D transformation network. So the motivation behind this work was, suppose this is an object, the cup, and now the robot want to grasp this object. So how much it should open its hand so that it can grasp this cup. If it does have the information of this cup, it can grasp it accurately. So for this we developed a 2D to 3D transformation network that take the partial information in terms of the 2D images as input, and it generate its corresponding 3D objects. The previous researcher used the geometric based techniques. Those are the traditional approaches, and they are limited in generalization, and they are also task specific. Like suppose they are using the mathematical model of a cup, but if we slightly vary the shape of that cup, then that mathematical modeling approach will fail, because it is only designed for a specific shape and type of a cup. So that's why they are limited in generalization and they are task specific. The other approaches are data driven. They learn the structure from the data. So the data driven approaches are more generalized, but the previous approaches either use 3D as input rather than 2D, so it's computationally expensive. Similarly, some of the approaches require the viewpoints and color information, which in some cases are not available, or in some cases they don't perform well because of lacking generalization. Similarly, most of these data-driven approaches are using single class objects, whereas we use this approach for multiple classes. I will go through this 2D to 3D transformation network in a stepwise manner. So this is the generator part of this 2D to 3D transformation network. This is the encoder part, and this is the decoder part. The encoder part take 2D image as input, and it encoded its to its latent representation, and then we use this latent representation to generate back the object, 3D object of this corresponding 2D image. So here we can see that the convolution operations are 2D, but in the decoder part the convolution operations are 3D. This is the mathematical representation of this encoder, where it take X as input and generate Y as output, and then this Y is this Y is output. Actually, we are using the generative adversarial network style architecture for this 2D to 3D transformation, which has two parts. One is the generator part that I discussed in the previous slide, and the second one is the discriminator part. Actually, we utilize this discriminator part for to also to join the two distributions from the 2D and 3D objects. So the discriminator part actually consists of Y-shaped, where in one branch it take 2D image as input and transform it to its corresponding distribution, this one. The second branch of this discriminator take 3D as input and then transform it to its corresponding distribution here. So there are actually two distribution of two different representation of the input object. One is related to the 2D object and the second one is related to the 3D objects. Both of those objects are similar to each other, but they have different representation. One is 2D and the second one is 3D. We want to transform or translate the 2D to its corresponding 3D. So we need a distribution which is the combination of their separate distributions. So what we did inside this discriminator, we combined those two distributions by using a fully connected network. So now this is the combined distribution of those two 2D and 3D distributions. So combination is important because now we have to like this if they are we can sample easily from that combined distribution. This is the overall architecture of this 2D to 3D transformation network. As I said that we used the generative adversarial network architecture for this specific task. So this is the generator part which take 2D as input, transform it into its corresponding latent representation and then generate a 3D object. Now in the discriminator part, in the typical generative adversarial network either take pair of the real images or the fake images. So in terms of the real images, this input is already real, and this is from the data. We give in one branch this 3D and in the second branch give this 2D, and then calculate its latent representation, combine its latent representation into a single distribution, and then classify it as a fake or real. Whereas in terms of the fake pair, this 2D is the original one, real one, but the 3D is coming from here. Now it go to the discriminator, and the discriminator combine those two distribution and then classify it into a real or fake. These are the training objective for the whole architecture. So this is the typical objective for the discriminator part of this network that I explained in my previous lectures. This is the typical objective for the generator part. For this whole architecture, we combine these two objectives, whereas we also combine the L2 laws, the autoencoder laws, to train this generator part, and this is the whole objective for the whole architecture, this 2D to 3D transformation network. We use two different kind of data. One we generated in our lab. Their data is 5 different class data, where we had 6,000 training samples and 500 testing samples of 5 different classes. So here we can see that this architecture can accurately generate the 3D representation of the 2D objects. This is the plate, cookie box, dental floss, drinking glass, and plastic plate. Similarly, we also use the ModelNet 40 dataset for testing this network. So these are the different 2D representation of the object in this row, and these are the corresponding target images, and this column, the third column, represent the generated 3D representation from the first column 2D images. Similarly, this column generate this third column 3D representation. This generate these, and these are the corresponding target objects, and these generate these 3D objects. We also tested this architecture whether it can learn the different view of a single objects or not. So this is sofa, and when we give this as input, it generate the 3D representation, and when we rotated it, it can accurately generate the multiple representation of this input object. Similarly, this is a chair, and when we rotate it, it can generate the multiple representation of these objects. However, there is one limitation of this architecture. Like suppose if the 2D input is kind of similar, like the representation is similar, because 2D image in itself has limitation, it does not contain the full information. So even though this 2D image belong to the desk, this 2D image belong to the table, this 2D image belong to the bathtub, and this 2D image belong to the bookshelf, and from our own eyes we cannot see the difference between these objects. So we tested this network on such challenging samples, and when we generated the output, it was kind of mixture of all those three representation. So it was not able to accurately reconstruct the 3D representation from the 2D images, which shows similarity to other classes, and it was a difficult example. To overcome the limitations of the previous architecture, we extended that architecture. So here, like in the previous architecture, the discriminator was taking the real pair where both the 2D and the 3D were real, whereas in terms of the fake pair, the 3D was generated one from here, but the 2D was still a real one. So it was inconsistent. So what we did here, we just put another 3D to 2D generator, which take 3D as input and generate its corresponding 2D. So now the discriminator, in terms of the real pair, it can take both 2D image and 3D representation as real, whereas in terms of the fake pair, it take generated 2D image and generated 3D object. So now it is consistent. Similarly, we use these autoencoder. One is this autoencoder, and the second one is this autoencoder. So what are the roles of these autoencoder? It actually helps this discriminator part to learn easily, because sometimes if we are providing this 2D this latent representation directly to the discriminator, the discriminator can go away from its optimal position, but these autoencoder ensures its proper latent representation, and we provide these latent representation to this discriminator part so that it can learn the proper latent spaces of the input 2D and 3D. So this architecture provides the flexibility of easy training as well as consistency. We checked this architecture with the ModernNet 40 dataset. So, and we also compared it with the previous architecture. So here we can see that it can effectively generate the 3D objects from the given 2D images. Here these are the ground truth, these are the results from the autoencoder, and these are the results from our previous architecture. So these look more realistic as compared to the previous one. Similarly, in the previous architecture, when we were providing the input which were looking similar even though they were from different classes, so that architecture was not able to distinguish between those objects. But here we can see that this is the ground truth and the generated images are here. So from here this one is generated, from here this one is generated, from here this one is generated. So here we can see that the generated output is very realistic. So similarly from here this one is generated, this one and this one. The middle row are the ground truth, which we like for testing. We provided the ground truth whether it can generate the realistic output or not. However, there are still some limitations of this architecture. Like suppose we provide this kind of shape. So this is actually belonging to this table limb, but here this part is missing in the generated image. This is the ground truth. Similarly, this one, so this portion, whole portion is missing. This is the table limb, and in 2D image, it looked like the monitor, but the actual 3D target is the table limb, and this network generated the monitor. Similarly, here we can see that this is also not correct. So these are some of the limitations of this architecture. So that was all about the 2D to 3D transformation network.